The whole world is sick.
Are you worried about America? I am.
Believe the impossible and you can do the incredible.
Welcome to another episode of The Catholic Patriot, and I am joined once again by Ted Flynn, and it's an honor to have him back. I mentioned in the last time we had our recent interview that there's going to be so many subjects that I would really love to get his informed opinion on, where everybody has an opinion. But I think Ted comes with perhaps the greatest contextual understanding, not just horizontally, but vertically. And so, Ted, thank you so much for coming back and joining us today.
Thank you. As I say, you've got a name, you love a name, the Fulton Sheen Institute. One of my all-time favorites, as I said last time.
Well, he's a great reference point. And you know, if you have one off the top of your head, I know you've got stories with Fulton Sheen. Is there one that you want to give us just to kind of kick things off?
Well, no, I mean, we mentioned last time that, I had spent several hours with him and had been a person responsible for inviting him to the National Prayer Breakfast in 1979. But the thing that I think of a lot, there's been some things that he said that have had a great impact, but I don't think anything has had a greater impact that he ever said or did than what he talked about, his holy hour. Mm-hmm. And if you ever heard the story where he said he once fell asleep on a park bench in Paris, but he said the Lord counted that as his holy hour, even though he fell asleep.
Yeah. And he asked the Lord, did it count? And he says, yeah, but don't do it again.
Yeah. But I mean, there is the source of his wisdom and strength, and his spirit was spending time in his holy hour, which is where he composed his talks. And most of his talks were right around the 20-minute range, because he knew people lose interest in focus after 20 minutes.
Right.
So they were and frankly, that's about the length of a rosary that the Blessed Mother herself, designed. So there's the whole thing of being able to focus for a set amount of time.
Well, that's a good launching point, because we need to be praying a lot these days, and I know more and more people they're very sensitive and waking up to all of the lies that have been surrounding us for so long, especially the last couple of years. But I want to focus our attention on, I think, which is perhaps the most complex geopolitical situation that falls so much, it seems, in the history of modern prophecy, and that is Russia and Ukraine. And just to remind our viewers, Ted Flynn is the co-founder with his wife Maureen of Signs and Wonders of Our Times, and they're online. They also have a physical magazine, and this is what they've been focusing on, helping us all throughout the world to understand what is making sense of what God is doing in this extraordinary moment of history, really unprecedented. It's like an apex that not just hundreds of years, but 2,000 years has been preparing for this transition from the tumultuous world that we're in now, through a purification and then an era of peace that Our Lady promised. And they have done such a service for us. So having Ted here, he brings that, I like to call it a historical theological perspective. Like Fulton Sheen would really describe it that way. He says you can look at the world at two levels: the horizontal, like a journalist, and simply report what is happening. But we need to look at it as a theologian and ask the question, why is it happening? And so with Ted on this, he had, I'm going to put it up here. You can see if you go to his website, sign.org, he has an article that, let's see if I can pull it up right here. There it is. He put in January 13th called Ukraine and the Prophecies of War. And I'd like to have Ted just kind of unpack that for us, because on one level, the media demonizes 100% Russia because they want Russia to be the scapegoat for pretty much everything, and the pretext to bring America into war and all of the West. And there's lots of reasons that make sense to see what they would be diverting the rest of the world from the COVID hoax and all those kinds of things. But how are you seeing this?
This area is such a complex area. I mean, you have a good percent of the entire intelligence community, of which there are 17 intelligence communities in the United States of America: Defense Intelligence, Navy Intelligence, Army Intelligence, the Central Intelligence, the National Security, which is heavy into the electronic side. And I would hate to guess what percent of budgets go to literally the Russian Federation today and previously the USSR previously. And I'd like to start, anticipating and knowing that you wanted to talk about this, I went back and just wrote down some notes and things to discuss that I think were very, very prescient and relevant. And I'd like to go back all of the way to literally the 1960s, where there was a man by the name of Anatoly Golitsyn. Many of Soviet scholars have known of him in a very big way. And he was actually a Soviet agent in Finland in the early 1960s, and he defected to the United States. And he released a book. He was a KGB agent, and he defected to the United States, where they brought him to here. And he released a book in 1984 called New Lies for Old. And again, his name is Anatoly Golitsyn, just as it sounds phonetically. And in that, he spoke about something that was the Soviet strategy. But let's first go back even now before that of what happened with the Jacobins and the Russian and the French Revolution. The revolutionaries believed in France pre-1789 that they could not defeat the monarchy because it was backed by the church. The church was organized, well-funded, distribution all throughout the country. It had been the pillar of the entire French community and civilization and country. And so they realized they couldn't defeat the church, so they had to infiltrate it from within. They needed a new strategy, and thus that became the French Revolution. The exact same thing happened with the Soviet Empire, and Golitsyn spoke about that. The Russians realized they could not defeat the United States and the West, principally due to its technology. So they needed to come up with a strategy that was very much something out of the ordinary, of strength to strength, and to infiltrate from within and defeat the United States that way, as well as the West. So when I say the United States, that's also the West, especially when it comes to France, Germany, and England with technology. So their strategy was the strategy was, in a nutshell, technology transfer. The way for them to begin to beat the West was to use our technology against ourselves. So they had to feign using the principles of Sun Tzu. When you're strong, appear to be weak, and vice versa. So it's the art of war. So they came up with a new strategy. How can we get this technology to compete with the West, where, again, we put a man on the moon in 1969, when by and large a lot of the world didn't have indoor plumbing and electricity. And look what was coming out of places like IBM Labs and Bell Labs with all sorts of technology. So they needed to get our transfer to compete, the technology transfer to compete with us, and especially in armaments. So that became the book that Anatoly Golitsyn wrote, that was their strategy. So what happened? In 1989, before perestroika and glasnost, and don't forget that word means restructuring. Perestroika means to restructure. And that's what the Soviet Union, don't forget, it fell really without a shot. There was no bloodshed. There were maybe a skirmish here and there. There were a lot of disappointed people. But Putin had said the greatest disaster of the entire 20th century was the fall of the USSR. Now, don't forget, that's 11 time zones from Vladivostok to St. Petersburg. That is from where I'm sitting right now in Eastern Time Zone in Washington, D.C. area. That's all the way to Perth, Australia. That's how big this vast country is, with all of its resources, ethnicities, and diversity, and everything else that comprises what is today the Russian Federation, of an incredibly diverse population. So that was their goal. So what happened? Gorbachev had said that we are going to lull the United States to sleep in front of the Politburo. And so that was a well thought out strategy that Golitsyn had spoken about. So in other words, through the art of deception, they were going to bring the United States to a place of lulling us to sleep, thinking all was fine, but they were still moving with their agenda. And so now you can go back to when Gorbachev was at the Presidio, which is in San Francisco, after he had come to the United States, and he had spent time at the Hoover Institute, at Stanford University, mingling there and traveling the country. Gorbachev said something very interesting. He said, had we used the principles of Antonio Gramsci, we would have been much more effective. Now, I can get into a little bit of the principles of Antonio Gramsci very briefly, but Gramsci was the co-founder of the Communist Party in Italy. And after the revolution in 1917, he went there in 1922, and he came away with the conclusion, after being there just a short amount of time, that the Russian Revolution wouldn't work. He said that Russia had a Christian soul. That was its history. And he said, if with this violence that the Communist Party was exerting upon the people, he said it won't last. So when he went back to Italy just after a brief time in Moscow, Mussolini feared him as the head of the Communist Party, and he threw him in jail. And in jail, he wrote something called the Prison Notebooks. This is very, very, very important. I think Gramsci was the greatest political mind literally since Machiavelli himself. And he said the way to defeat the West, capitalism, the church, and everything that we want as communists, is to infiltrate from within, get a person in there who is sympathetic to our cause. Now, any single person who has ever been in a seminary knows that one homosexual in a seminary can actually infect the entire seminary. So there is the concept of infiltration from within. So if you take a look at the principles of Antonio Gramsci, with Golitsyn, and specifically what Gorbachev said, had they gone the more gradual approach of socialism incrementally to lull the people to sleep, communism would have been successful. It was a huge statement to Gorbachev to make at the Presidio. And it went around the world to the people who understood what he was saying, and to everybody else, they just simply didn't grab it, of how profound that statement was. Had we used the principles of Antonio Gramsci, we would have been effective. So there's a little bit of the backdrop on the historical that I think is very important to understand today. Because for me, the Russian bear is still that. It's the Russian bear. A bear doesn't, you can never see the expression on a bear's face, anger, other than if its mouth is open. And the Soviet Union is preparing for war. And it's not going to be the type that we will think. You know, um, when we listen to the news, we have to realize we're being manipulated by very, very sophisticated people with psychological operations, grooming us to think a certain way. And by and large, the liberal mainstream press just simply doesn't get anything. They just put out the party line believing it. And so we have to realize there's really a game being played um, above most everyone's head that they really don't understand.
What you were referring to was earlier with the agenda to infiltrate the United States. There's a really powerful interview. I have it on the course that I put together on the Fulton Sheen Institute that breaks down this whole history of the infiltration of Marxism and communism and beyond. And I'm sure you know Yuri Bezmenov. There's that famous interview, and he talks about the ideological subversion. And I don't know which network it was, but it was a major one. And you can just Google it and pull it up. And he talked about the 4 stages of how they were going to subvert the American people, because they knew that by force it wasn't going to happen, and they've been completely successful all the way up to the present. With Russia today, with what's happening though right now, there's 2 things that really stand out for me. Is there's Russia before the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then there's the Russia post 1984 consecration of the world by John Paul II. And then, 5 years later, is the beginning of the political collapse, you can say, of the Soviet Union and the surrounding regions there, and the return of Russia to its Christian roots, like you were talking about. And Fulton Sheen talked about this too, because he was extremely hopeful about Russia. As was St. Maximilian Kolbe, as you know, he talked about one day the statue of the Immaculata will be brought to Moscow. And he said not in the too distant future. And Sheen said, and I think this really corresponds with a lot of the private revelation too, is that Russia, when it does come back, will probably be the first to, and will lead in the evangelization of the world, including and especially the West, which has become completely secularized. And taking what you said, and that what communism needed to be what it became was an Asiatic soul. That was what Fulton Sheen talked about. And the Russians have that. They have fire. They have all of these things that the West didn't have. And now Russia, this is my own thought on this, but it seems pretty evident, has been moving away from even if there's underpinnings still present, from their communist philosophy and looking more toward rediscovering their Christian roots. I mean, they've rejected the woke culture. They've rejected everything culturally that we've embraced that has made us completely rotten from the inside out. Like Lincoln would say, he never saw the United States being conquered from without. He said, if it ever falls, it'll be from within, morally and religiously. That's right. And so Russia is like the only country, other than some of the Eastern countries, like Poland, Hungary seems pretty much similar. And what's happening now with the Ukraine situation seems to me, I tend to agree with a really good article I read by Pat Buchanan, and it was talking.
It was just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, not even.
Yeah,
right. And the way that the Russia is acting toward the Ukraine by massing 100,000 plus troops, and ready to go, and they've got positions, there's submarines everywhere around the world right now, is like their own version of the Monroe Doctrine. Like the Ukraine's like the last thing standing, It's like Cuba having missiles so close off of our coastline, and Russia
90
saying
miles off our coast, yeah.
exactly. So if NATO basically continues to move into Ukraine and then work to make Ukraine a member of it, there's, from a Russian perspective, it's, I don't say checkmate, but it is kind of like that. And how is a war not inevitable? Because they want to protect their region and their sovereignty. And, so this is why I find this so complex, because I totally understand that. Now, there's other ramifications going on in the relationship between the Ukrainians and Russia. If Ukraine is going to go NATO or Russia, which is better for Ukraine? I don't think there's going to be a neutral zone. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, I think you've got to listen to the people who have boots on the ground there. And just this week, I talked to a friend of mine who has had a mission work there for the help building of churches in the Ukraine, where he's made 38 mission trips there, delivering money and helping with resources so the Ukrainian can build their churches again. And that's what he's been doing. And we had a long conversation just the other day on this, and we were talking that even from my time there, I never found anybody as warm in their own homes as the Russians, where I spent a lot of time in Belarus for 2 years on and off. And I had an office for 2 years in an apartment in Poland, where I never found anybody as warm in their own homes as the Russian and Ukrainian and Belarusian people. But I've got to tell you, when they got in the street, they were mean. In their homes, they were kind. If you admire, I made a mistake one of my first trips there. I admired a little trinket, and they forced me to leave with it. They got angry. I mean, I had just admired it. And I guess it's one of these cultural things. If you admire something, you're supposed to give it to somebody. It was just a small little glass piece. And I was being very sociable, and I was admiring it. And, but you have to remember, about 3% of the people are what they call apparatchiks, or the nomenklatura, which is the leadership. And they're nasty, nasty, atheistic communist people. And they're not, frankly, unlike a lot of the leadership in the United States or other countries, that to go along and get along and go along, you'll get along, to where you are, in essence, bought off with your position, which we've seen a lot what's happened in government in the United States with the policies that they've been promulgating all throughout the United States, and all regulatory type bodies crushing the will of the American people. And it's happening now in Canada, and it's happening throughout Europe, and it's happening a lot with these vaccine mandates, where literally the government is crushing the people through psychological operations as well as enforcement to get their way. That is also happening in Russia. So I always separate the Russian people. So when people speak about, what's happening, the Soviet military are nasty. Putin, as it was a KGB officer who became head of the president, he's got $100 million yacht. They think he's worth $20 billion offshore that he shipped. I saw a very interesting thing just happened the other day, where if you saw in the news just yesterday or the day before, he's calling his yacht out of Germany, which has been there for repairs. So it's just been moved out yesterday. So what's that about? He just doesn't want it seized. Is he ready to move there? The answer is, I don't know what Putin's going to do, and I don't think anybody in the United States definitively knows what Putin's going to do. But he is resolute on this. And the friend of mine who was a missionary and has been for 26 years, where he said to date, Putin has shown great restraint by not going into Europe or into the Ukraine. I think Putin's ultimate goal is Europe. And I can read something that, Elena Aiello has said, a mystic in the church, and Catherine Emmerich, where the prophecy is that Russia is going to go to Europe, and they're going to go into Spain, they're going to go into Italy, and they're going to literally put the communist flag on the dome of St. Peter's. So that's the prophecy. And don't forget, in the Eastern Rite, we have, 22 or 23 Eastern Rite Catholic Church. It's a lot of the Uniates being more in the Ukraine, Melkite, Maronite, and other rites. Ruthenian, you've got the Indian from India that are under the authority of Rome as Roman Rite, Eastern Rite Catholics in going along with Rome. But I think you have to separate what the nomenclatura and the leadership will do versus the Russian people. And you mentioned the consecration. And so there's a big difference. The Russian people are very, very kind people.
So why would they go along with that in the sense of, I mean, the greatest threats that I've seen so far, of course, is the establishment of the New World Order. And Russia's one of the powers, you could say, among others, that are vying for it. And you've got China. I mean, yeah, you have these alliances or whatever, loosely between, or not even alliances, but friendships, all utilitarian between Russia and China because they're neighbors and other things. But maybe I'm wrong. It just seems that the last country I would think that would want to try to do anything like that would be Russia because of the rising power of China. What that would do to the Russians, like, why would they, especially with the people having, let's say, stronger Christian hearts, why would they be behind that? How would that be possible? With so many other threats, if they do that, what China could do with Russia and start their own wars, like with Taiwan, and I mean, they're going to be moving their own globalist agenda. I know it's a lot of chessboards, it seems, going on at once, but I haven't been able to get myself to see that Russia's the threat, even though they may be the catalyst with what's going on now for sparking what will be potentially massive. I don't know. I that's something that I struggle with. Like I said, I'm more, because of what they've done culturally and where they're way ahead of where America is. Is that all a front of Putin? Is he complete? Do you believe that his heart is communist, his Christian,
well,
at
he
least on
talked about
appearance,
his
is a facade?
Putin talked about his grandmother being a believer and a Christian, and everywhere I ever went, they always talked about a grandparent who was actually a Christian and tried to transfer the faith, but it was always a grandparent because. So I was there, 25, 30 years ago. And so you would have heard it more, but it was never the parents because they went along. But, when you talk about would Russia do something, Russia has a very, very powerful government that can enforce laws the same way we see in the United States with the strength of government. I mean, look at the types of laws that we're passing. I mean, let's face it, when you can go into a school, and you want to talk how far pagan we are now, when a person can call a man a woman, when she's the transgender individual is a man, and you can be thrown out of school for it or fired from your job for calling somebody by a wrong gender. We're very, very far gone politically as a nation when we can't identify somebody by their right gender that is obvious. And we see this Pennsylvania swimmer right now, this UPenn swimmer, to where it was a man. Now he's winning all of the races by laps, and he's walking around the locker room, the woman's locker room, naked, and the women all resent it. So when that's enabled, that's showing you how strong a government is to enforce their rules. And that's why I always make a distinction between the Russian military and government and the Russian people. But Catholic prophecy has Russia moving all throughout Europe. Let me read just one or two brief, it's probably less than a paragraph, with Sister Elena Aiello. She lived in Italy and died in 1961 and was a victim soul who bore the stigmata, if you remember.
Is she blessed?
I actually forget. Blessed versus venerable right now with all
Sure.
these people. During one vision of Jesus Christ on August 22, 1916, he stated to her, "The world is flooded by a deluge of corruption. The governments of the people have arisen as demons in human flesh, and even though they speak of peace, they prepare for war with devastating weapons that can annihilate peoples and nations. If people do not return to God with truly Christian living, another terrible war will come from the east to the west. Russia with her secret armies will battle America and will overrun Europe." So that's from Sister Elena Aiello. And there's another quote that she's got. Well, and I want to get back to what Sister Lucy said at Fatima.
It seems so opposite from the direction things are moving today, where the focus is really on China. And really, that's the errors of Russia really has been, compared to most countries, has exited Russia more than any other country, which has been welcoming them in, from China in their own way, and then to the West. And
they've infiltrated. It's what they've done with these, especially China. We're being surrounded by communists.
Right. But is that the goal of Russia? Is everything a facade then? And they still want to reinstate communism?
Well, that's what I'm saying. I don't think the leadership, based upon the technology transfer and Gorbachev, what he said, I don't think Russia at the very, very top of the apparatchiks in the leadership have ever changed. I believe that has been their modus from the very beginning. Now, okay, let's say it's 3% and the other is 97%. So what percent of our American government are flat out corrupt individuals just going along for the money and the prestige and the jobs and everything else versus the American people that are, a lot of them are very, very good people. But Sister Aiello wrote again, Russia will march on all the major nations of Europe, particularly Italy, and will raise her flag over the Dome of St. Peter's. And we know that should have shut that off. Sorry about that. But let's go back to what Sister Lucy said, that Russia would become the scourge of the earth. Now, how much has really changed? But she said, if my requests are heard, Russia will be converted and there will be peace. If not, she will spread her errors throughout the world, fomenting wars and persecution of the church. The good will suffer martyrdom. The Holy Father will suffer much. Different nations will be annihilated. Let's look at that word annihilated. I talked to John Haffert many hours on that. Is that a spiritual annihilation or actually a physical annihilation of countries? The debate
or both.
Or both. The debate is still open on that, even according to John Haffert, who I spoke with a lot before he died. But he said, Sister Lucy said, but in the end, my Immaculate Heart will triumph. The Holy Father will consecrate Russia to me, which will be converted, and some time of peace will be granted to humanity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
you go back to, let me just say, you talk about Gorbachev has been resolute. The line in the sand for Gorbachev is trying to bring in Ukraine into NATO. He does not want that. As he said, you can be a matter of minutes before you can launch missiles right into Moscow Square, right into the Kremlin. And
Right.
so to him, that's unacceptable. Now, whether or not he's saber rattling to show the world right now with his warships all over the Crimea, the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, troops surrounding every direction. Right now, Ukraine, to where he said, there can be, he can be in Kiev in hours if he needs to be. So what he's actually doing versus trying to get a concession that, look what happened with us with the United States, with Kennedy and Khrushchev, where there was a standoff and to see who would buckle first, to where the United States simply said there cannot be missiles 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And so Khrushchev pulled his ships back. So, Putin is saying it's unacceptable. Ukraine cannot become a member of NATO. It's too close to our home. And don't forget Kiev Rus, that trade route from Kiev to Russia, which Kiev Rus. It's just a short distance there.
Now, there's a somewhat famous comment that was made by Father Malachi Martin, who claimed that he was privy to have seen the contents of the third part of the Secret of Fatima, and it is recorded. There's an audio of it, but he doesn't say much other than basically keep your eyes on Russia and Ukraine. That's the whatever it is. It's perhaps the spark that send things up. I don't know. Is there other information that we've learned about that, or is that still an
No, as a
enigmatic
matter of
statement?
fact, in the article that you showed, Ukraine and the Prophecies of War, I actually put that Malachi Martin quote in there because he did the introduction for my first book, The Thunder of Justice. And I talked with him many times in his apartment, and he actually came down once to Virginia, where I filmed him for a documentary. But he had said to me that, he had been privy to it, and he said, always keep your eyes on Ukraine. Now, did I understand what that really meant? In the early 90s when he told me that versus today, no. But I do now. Because don't forget, especially in the East, in the Donbass region, there's a tremendous amount of Russian ethnicity in there that identify with Russia. That's specifically in the city of Donetsk. And there's a mystic out of Brazil who's got an incredible track record that has specifically said Russia will go into the Ukraine. His name is Pedro Regis. Now, I'm not going to vouch for him other than he has his endorsement from a bishop as a mystic, which isn't done much, where a mystic will get approbation and an endorsement from a bishop, but he's had it. And he has specifically said Russia will go in the Ukraine, and he specifically mentioned the city of Donetsk. Mm-hmm. Now, what is Ukraine? Ukraine is really Russia's breadbasket. I mean, they've got a reason to be there for agriculture. Mm-hmm. But, they took the Crimea in 2014 over about a 3 or 4 week period. And, down in Sevastopol, it's where the Black Sea Fleet is headquartered. So, they're very firmly entrenched in there already. They speak the same language. They're Slavs. The difference between Ukrainian and Russian is not that great. They go in and out of each other's countries with ease as a part of the federation. So, I mean, they know the lay of the terrain there. So what is Putin really doing, versus a long-term strategy that we really don't see of what's happening in the War College in the Kremlin? The answer is I don't know. And I think anybody that says they know is speculating.
Seems like everything is speculation at this point.
Yeah.
It's tough. Yeah, because I think that article by Pat Buchanan I thought was very insightful to understand. Definitely one, I think, strongly potential reason for what they're doing is to have this kind of their own version of the Monroe Doctrine. For us to cross that line is a threat to our own sovereignty and our own needs. We did it, but that was in the 1820s, and then we've done it many other times since. When I was researching that, how many times we used it. As our strength increased, we used it more and more. And so, funneling this back into prophecies, we kind of get near the end of our time together. I had Daniel O'Connor on. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he's a big proponent and advocate, and he's written a lot on Servant of God, Louisa Picaretta, and the Divine Will. And he had mentioned a prophecy given to Conchita at Garabandal that talked about that the warning would take place after the Pope went to Moscow. Are you familiar with that? Because there's been lots of talk in recent months, even going back to December, it's almost all but scheduled, because the patriarch in Moscow there's like an invitation, and they haven't solidified it yet.
Well,
it just seems like
the patriarch's representative, Kirill's representative, met with the Vatican personnel, but there was no date set. Now, my pet, after being around Marian apparitions now for 40 years, my pet of all of them by far is Garabandal. And it's the heart and soul of the Thunder of Justice, specifically the warning and the great miracle. Because I think we're going to speak around those events, literally like before Christ and after Christ. From the birth and the redemption of mankind before Christ to after Christ AD. I think we're going to speak in the coming years of before the warning and after the warning. But the quote, now I've been around this now, as I said, literally since the late 70s, around Garabandal, when I first really learned about it in 78 is when I first learned about Garabandal and began to read about it. And I literally have banker boxes in my basement where I'm sitting right now, filled with everything ever done on Garabandal, all the way to Joey Lomangino's magazine, which was originally called Needles. Then it became the Garabandal, and now it's the Garabandal Journal with Barry Hanratty. So I tracked down that quote of the Pope going to Moscow. Now, the Pope was on his way home from Cyprus in Greece, where he said he wanted to go. But he has to be invited by the president. A Pope will only go, he would like to be invited by the religious leader, but he wants to be invited by the president of a country to keep those relationships. Now, whether or not Putin has agreed to it, I don't know. And I don't know why he wouldn't, because I know that Putin has a great interest in the third secret of Fatima and has made inquiries historically on it. In what it actually is on Fatima and its secrets. And so I think whatever Gorbachev is going to do, nobody specifically knows. And I said I think they're speculating with an opinion, and we all have opinions. But
are you referring to Putin? I'm sorry, you mentioned Gorbachev.
I'm sorry, Putin.
Okay.
Yeah, I meant Putin. Sorry. And so I tracked down that quote, and I talked to the people who know Glenn Hudson, who's very involved in Garabandal. I know people who know Conchita, who see her at Mass. I have personally spoken to Conchita on the phone. She even came to one of our Rosary Congresses in the early 90s, took a train down, sat there, said the Rosary in the shrine, and literally left unannounced, very demurely and respectfully. And so the Garabandal quote came from Albrecht Weber. There's the origin of the quote. Now, that the part that always bothered me about the Pope with the warning after that is that all of these years, I never really read that until Tom Fay released his book suddenly and unexpectedly. And he quoted Weber. And so the origin of that quote is Albrecht Weber of Germany. And he heard that in 1965 from Conchita's mother at a at a table in her house. That's the origin of that quote, because I felt it was so significant. Now, why is it possibly true? The answer is Albert Weber gave his life to Garabandal. He's German. He was a big believer in it, and in no way would he harm it. And Tom Fay, had a home in Garabandal. His group still may own it. He would never in any way harm it, nor would Barry Hamratty or Richard Everson or anybody who has ever written on it would never want to harm it. But several people have doubted that it was ever realistic. But Barry Hamratty, the editor of the Garabandal Journal, believes there's no reason to doubt it. But why, after all of these years, has that been kept? Everybody has been, the big parlor game for many, many years is trying to guess the year of the warning and the day of the miracle, because we know it's March, April, May, or June for the miracle between the 8th and the 16th of the month on a Thursday on the feast of a young Eucharistic martyr at 8:30 p.m. Spanish time. So everybody's been trying to guess this, especially since the new millennium in the year 2000. And so now just recently this has all come up, which I find a little odd. But everybody who has written about it would in no way ever want to harm Garabandal, to where Albrecht Weber is actually buried there in Garabandal.
Interesting. Well, of course, I'm looking at my clock here and I see that we're basically at the end. I would love to continue to this conversation, in particular, because I'm going through your book that I want to recommend for everybody, Diabolical Disorientation. That's taken from the words of Sister Lucia herself. Could actually put it on the screen for people to see, right there in the middle. You can see it there. Highly recommend it. It's this is Ted's. This is your latest book, right? Because this came out in 2020, right before everything broke out. Isn't that interesting? The timing of that, and how you say in the very beginning, it's comprised of a series of articles that were first written in early 2011 and continue to this day. And they are. I've read some and I've skimmed through others. This is a book that everybody should have. And what I wanted to get into next, but we are out of time for this one, is I guess it's your second article, The Secret Meaning of the Number 18 in Our Lady, because that could potentially tie into what we're talking about with the warning and things that are happening. I agree that with the way things are going, the warning is going to be such a pre and post event in measuring history that maybe that's what helps make sense for me, at least, when I go into other books like, I'm sure you've seen this one, Yves Dupont.
I know it well.
Yeah.
Good book.
It's interesting. There's just so much that this is like a whole other angle, it seems, of prophecies, because the U.S. is hardly mentioned in anything in here. And even I think in general, it's not mentioned too much. You can correct me on that in the future for sure. But it just seems that Russia is going to be the catalyst to help bring the world back. So that's why I struggle with. We're going to have to. Well, if the other prophecies are true, they're actually going to have this like communist run all the way to Rome. In the meantime, you got China and all these other, I think, much bigger issues. And Yves Dupont talks so much about Islam, which is like in the background of everything else that's going on right now. It's like something like what's going to happen. It's very difficult to see which lens.
It's very, very complex. The warning in the miracle actually could stop all of this, because it's going to be the most significant event in the history of the world. it's going to rank up there literally with the incarnation and the resurrection in terms of its impact on humanity, where, think of it, every single person sees the state of their soul as God would see it, because as a world, we are collectively lost. I mean, we see this love fest right now happening with China and Russia. Could you imagine if Russia decided to move on the Ukraine and China decided to move on Taiwan at the same time?
Exactly.
I think if they did it, they would do it under a weak president like Biden.
Oh, this is the perfect storm for all of that to happen. And the pieces are in place. It's not rhetoric. I mean, China's buzzing almost daily with their fighter jets over Taiwan. I mean, this is highest alert you can imagine that we can't quite fathom here in the U.S. because we have our own things going on and we're so distracted. And it's incredible how things are set up for something massive. And on that note, was bringing it back to, this is why every single day we need to be living the message of Fatima. We need to be praying our rosaries in our home every day. We need to be getting our souls right with God, going to confession as frequently as we can. They always say at least once a month. I'd say probably more common because you never know what's going to change any day. Have brown scapulars on your children and teach them what it means. I mean, we've been given a blueprint. And while all this is unfolding, and as fascinating as it is, I pray to God we don't experience it, because it will be beyond our imagination what would unravel. But Our Lady has promised those who are faithful and live out her message that her Immaculate Heart will be our refuge. Those were her words, and that should give us peace.
That's why I always speak about the refuge is in her Immaculate Heart. When we are there, any safety the world has to offer us will come from there. It won't come from any place else.
Amen. Well, Ted, that does bring us to the end. I would love to have you on regularly. I know you are writing a lot right now. You shared that with me. You're very busy. But what you're providing for us, this important history and context, and helping us to see the horizontal and the vertical together, I think is at the heart of the responsibility of our prophetic nature, of our baptism, and you've been really blessed to have that. So I'd love to, if you're willing, have you back on in the future.
We'll pick a subject. You've got quite a few.
I have a lot of them I'm going to pick up from here.
Oh, yeah.
And your other book, I'm going to post up before we go. I'm going to post that one up too. This is another must-have. It's a lot thicker, but if you want everything in one book of how you understand what is going on, like the forces, the dynamics driving our history, Hope of the Wicked. My course on the final hour on the Fulton Sheen Institute website is a video version of this, but it's also as complex as what I have out there. It's still like the bottom line, and Ted takes you much deeper into the things that I didn't intend to go that deep in, to really put pieces together. So there it is. I have it here on my desk, so you can see that nice casual reading time there. Start with this one, and I really hope that we can go more deeply into this, because I think these are the pressing questions that people have, and we could fill in the gaps with the Hope of the Wicked content, because it is important to really know what the left hand is doing while the right hand's doing this. Because
even the subtitle of that is I was the village idiot for quite a few years. That came out in 2000, where I showed what I call it a cabal of evil men were really conspiring to do. And the master plan to rule the world, being called a conspiracy theorist. But what we now know is that it is the deep state that just came about in the last few years, but it's really a book about how the deep state operates. Mm-hmm. But sign.org carries those.
Great. Well, I'll have that also on our screen when we're watching this. You'll be able to see it right now. And also you can check out other articles that Ted has been doing. Please check out these works. I highly recommend them. And of course, as we transition back to outside of this, to our home life, remember that's where we have to fortify things, because the final battle is over marriage and the family, and we've got to fortify that. Just like Ted was saying, that putting our family in the refuge of Mary's Immaculate Heart really is going to be the answer. I mean, in a complex world, it's so simple that 3 little children could follow it and do it heroically. So that's going to be ours. So thank you, Ted, for joining us here. Say hi to Maureen, and I can't wait to have you on again in the future.
We'll pick a subject. Just let me know. I enjoy it.
Great. Thanks, Ted. God bless you.
All right, bye-bye.
Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us for another episode of The Catholic Patriot. So much to ponder and so much to pray about. Make sure we're spending some dedicated time each day in prayer. If we've got time, so go through your schedule and make sure you've got that blocked out. Take these things and ponder them in your heart, and more importantly, put them into practice. So thanks for joining us for another episode of The Catholic Patriot.
Right is right if nobody is right. Wrong is wrong if everybody is wrong. And believe me, in this error-infested world, what we really need is a church and an authority that is right not when the world is right, but one that is right when the world is wrong.
Never in history has the prayer of the Rosary been more needed to save our families, our countries, and defeat the evils of the world than now. The Fulton Sheen Institute worked closely with the Roman Rosary to develop the most unique, beautiful, and meaningful rosary that was inspired by Fulton Sheen's World Mission Rosary. This special handcrafted rosary continues Sheen's passion to support the mission of the Church to evangelize the entire world. Each decade of the rosary has a different color, which corresponds with a different continent. Yellow for Asia, red for the Americas, white for Europe, blue for the nations of Oceania, and green for Africa. Each Fulton Sheen Aroma Rosary comes with a set of 4 pure essential oil blends that have been chosen for their therapeutic and theological significance. These blends correspond to the 4 mysteries of the Rosary. Simply choose the oil for the mystery of the day, drop a small drop in the palm of your hand, and massage the oil over the surface, being sure to catch the lava beads. You're good to go, and your prayer will linger longer with these beautiful aromatic notes. Every Fulton Sheen Aroma Rosary you purchase supports our mission to fight the battle for the hearts and souls of the Christian family and lead our world back to God. So visit the Fulton Sheen Institute's store and pick up your beautiful Fulton Sheen Aroma Rosary today. Get one for you, your family members, and your close friends, and don't forget your pastor. Thank you so much for your prayers and your support.